Hello, everybody. This is Venkat from Ribbon Farm, and I'm back with another video interview. And this time I am speaking with David Bosshart, who I've known for several years. He's the head of the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute, I hope I pronounced that right, in Zurich. And GDI, as the acronym is, they've invited me several times to Switzerland to work with them, do workshops and give talks. And it's been a lot of fun working with them and learning all about things in Europe. And what I have for you today is just David and I chatting about Europe versus America, the tech scene, the political and economic scene, and how software might eat the world in Europe in particular. And the reason for this conversation right now is that the folks at GDI had just released a German language translation of my Breaking Smart essays. And we are hoping that this helps some people in Germany sort of get introduced to these ideas who might not otherwise have. So that's the context for this talk. And David, maybe you want to say a little bit more about GDI and your work there?
Yeah, thank you, Venkat. GDI is an independent think tank. We were founded by Mr. Duttweiler, who was a philanthrope, and he also created Migros, the largest retail chain. Our institute basically is his legacy. So we do workshops, we do studies on premise for companies, an outlook about the next 5 to 10 years. And basically we started with understanding consumer behavior. Now we're doing many studies for many industries and also operate a few conferences.
Yep, so that's GDI, guys, and I strongly recommend that if you're ever in Zurich and you're interested in sort of technology matters and things, you should check these guys out. Among other things, they have this lovely location in Ruschlikon, right? Right by the lake, and beautiful views.
The most beautiful place you might imagine, that's true.
Yeah.
We're very privileged in terms of location.
Yeah. And that alone is a good excuse to do anything you can to do some work with GDI.
You're right.
Yeah.
And you're always welcome.
Glad I'm always welcome. So David, let's get started with one of the things that interests me the most, which is big picture macroeconomic differences between the US and Europe, particularly in relation to the big issue of sovereign debt, the Greek and Italian crises, and how that shapes the overall economic environment in Europe for doing business technology innovation.
Yeah, thank you, Anka. That's a very good and very appropriate question. Listen, when you look at the European community, European Union, you see a puzzle. And this puzzle was built around, over the last 15 years now, around the euro as a currency. And we see that over the last few years, you see a complete difference between the strongly performing countries like Germany, and so especially in the south, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, but also more France, who are the weaker part. So you see a divide between high performing, and Germany is in the lead by far. So it should also be the political leader, but you don't see real leadership. Angela Merkel is brilliant in execution, but she's not a visionary. So you see these puzzle parts are basically falling apart, but within the nations you still have a lot of optimism. When you go to Italy, people are quite optimistic. They have had quite a lot of chaos for many decades already. So they know how to thrive, how to go on. Whereas Germans or Swiss people, they need a well-organized structure in order to have economic growth. So you see the culture element is already there. And Germany, I think, is too big in terms of the economy for Europe, but it's too small to compete directly with China or with the United States. So it is an elephant in terms of what's going on in the economy, very strong. But when you look at politics, it's rather a mouse. And in terms of military and defense all over Europe, it's quite only a worm. This in a nutshell.
So can you elaborate a little bit more on how that sort of imbalance between Germany and the South and this sort of too big for Europe, too small to play with the US and China kind of awkward position. And now in the political side, as opposed to the economic side, you've got Brexit and sort of the whole European equation being renegotiated. So you guys do futures at GDI, right? So speculatively...
We as Swiss, we are small. We always had to be very innovative, to be very special, because also we have a very strong currency, the Swiss franc. So we were always beaten by the outside, and we had to improve, especially the high-end manufacturing business. And so we always had to learn. So we are in a very special situation. We can say Switzerland is basically, there are some people who say we are the gold piece in a cow patty compared to Europe. And others say we are just the cow patty in a green meadow. So it depends on the perspective you have on Switzerland. But I think the economy is doing quite well, like in many other places, also in Northern Europe. We cannot complain. But I think it's really the political side that creates a lot of uncertainties. Brexit, I think no one knows where it's going. In short term, you see, there's no real effect. People are still optimistic when you talk to business people, but there is more the psychological effect behind it. But when you look at the hardcore factors and figures, you also must understand that the leave of Britain is a major blow to the European community. Why? Because when you put together all the GDP, Britain is as strong in terms of just GDP as the 20 smallest members of the European community.
Wow.
So you must see all the small countries put together. The 20 smallest has the power, the economic power of the UK. So this puts more pressure than ever on Germany.
So, so that obviously alters the economic balance of power. But at the same time, the political balance of power is also shifting across Europe and Britain, right? You've got the new resurgent right. So you just said that Angela Merkel is good at execution, but she lacks enough vision to sort of lead Germany as the center of the new Europe. So what about the political power coalescing around the new right? Is that going to like have a big influence in reshaping the future?
Well, I wouldn't actually call it the new right. I think it is very complicated to understand the different dynamics in the different countries. Look at the case of France. France wanted, after Sarkozy, only one thing: to get rid of him. So they elected Hollande. Right now, everybody hates Hollande. So the only thing is to get rid of him and then to have probably Sarkozy back, which is insane. But I think in the US, it's a little bit the same situation. Those who vote for Hillary Clinton vote against Trump. Those who vote for Trump vote against Hillary Clinton. So you have the problem of the party system all over Europe. The strong, let's say, idea-driven parties, socialists, liberals, conservatives, are more and more diluted. And I think the German case is especially interesting because it is special. Traditionally, you had no real serious party, right, of the CDU, Angela Merkel's party. But as she shifted more towards the left, she created a vacuum. So when you look at the alternative for Germany, you have a chaotic mixture of very different people, attracting a lot of people from, let's say, honestly people in the middle class, on the other side, extremists from the far right. So I think it will be very interesting to see whether this party can stabilize or not. But right now, also when you see the election in Berlin, it's really chaotic. So you have minorities of minorities that try to create a majority. And the lack of stability, I think, is you cannot govern with 23 or 18 or 17%. So then you turn ever more away from strategy, you do only tactics, just to adjust how can you have the next round. And this, I think, is very dangerous. You don't care about that level, you just care about being elected and re-elected.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because I think most of the West, whether it's the US presidential system or the European, which has more of a parliamentary system, de facto, both are two-party kind of political environments, even though there's potential for coalition politics. So I think Italy has had periods of strong coalition politics. And growing up in India, I saw the transition from basically one party rule with the Congress to like a weak second party. And then throughout the 90s, there was like huge political chaos because of coalition politics. Like no party ever had the majority. So you had like these weird coalitions of like extreme communists and like right-wing nationalists and all sorts of equations that nobody would think would be possible. And
a lot of confusion. And I think people who vote, they have no more any leadership they can trust. And I think the trust factor is probably the most important. Also, when you correlate it with, do you trust that economic growth will come, that you have a good life? So the biggest danger, I think, right now is people just vote against something very emotionally, fact-free. Like in the US, you're going to have the first fact-free election. It's just emotion with emotions. And that is very dangerous.
Yeah.
So it becomes too much short-termism, no longer structured with ideas like in the old party system. Right now, when you go to Germany, ask someone, what is social? What is socialist? Even in the left side, they have no clue. Everybody can cite Marx, but no one has read Marx.
Uh-huh.
I would argue that the old party system had quite a well-fed intellectual ground, but today it is just much more about tactics. And a lot of people in the younger generation, they no longer go to politics because they think it's a waste of time, which is very dangerous.
So that's a good segue point for, I guess, actually, before we do that, yeah, one of the themes you sent me beforehand about that would be good to discuss is you asked me about what's good for GM is good for the US and how that's now become what's good for Google is good for the US. But flipping that around, is there something similar in Europe?
No, we don't have that. I think that most Europeans have a very selective view of the United States. They see Silicon Valley, of course, it's the Googles, it's the Amazons, it's the Apples, but they don't really know what's going on. Let's say in just states you don't talk about. We see the East Coast, we see the West Coast, a little bit Chicago, a little bit Miami, but I think the overall picture of the US is complex and it is really highly selective perceived here in Europe. So I think we tend to perceive right now the US as something that is very strongly still driven by Wall Street on one side, but more and more on Silicon Valley. That's why I quoted what is good for General Motors is good for the US, then it became what is good for Goldman Sachs is good for the US. Now it is probably Google. Is this true? Is this too really short-sighted? And what might be next?
So I want to respond to that question as you posed it, but before I did that, I wanted to ask if there's something similar like that in Europe. I meant, is there a sentiment that like say, what's good for BMW is good for Europe, or what's good for Deutsche Bank is good for Europe? Is there like some sort of, because from the US, it actually looks like Europe is the place with extremely strong corporate government connections, like, what's called corporatism with extremely strong sort of nation to economic coupling. So how do people perceive European big corporations in Europe? That is my question.
Yes, I think that when you go to Germany, clearly it is what they call the Mittelstand, meaning all the mid-sized companies, most often family-owned, very loyal, but very loyal to also to the employees. When they have an economic downturn, they just probably even use their own money. So it is a very loyal way to have a family-oriented business, even if you have 5,000 or 10,000 employees, but it is paternalistically governed in a way that, but governed in a way at the same time that is very performance-driven. So they are very often what is called the hidden champions. You don't know about them. They are very really in the back. You don't talk about them. You don't talk about them in the public, but they are highly hidden and they are very, let's say, inward looking. So I think they're very strong in terms of engineering. I think engineering is still their strength, but the Germans still, I think they still are a hardware, just to make the distinction. This is a hardware country.
Mm-hmm.
They became very wealthy with all the automotive industry, the best brands, well-known brands, and with their suppliers. So I think it will be very interesting to see when we look at about what is going on, software is eating the world in Germany, whether the automotive industry is capable of radical change or not. I was more pessimistic 5 years ago than I'm right now. I see now a lot of movement and I see a lot of learning. So especially, probably even more on the supplier side, I see companies that are very interested in just buying startups, collaborating, having a partnership with digital companies. So I see when this elephant is being shaken, then they can learn. But it takes much more time. They are conservative in terms of the approach of the new thing.
It's interesting what you say, because
Switzerland is completely different. Switzerland has always had big neighbors. We had France, we had Germany, Austria was a different case, Italy is again very different, but we had to figure out who are our friends. So the Swiss, for example, always tended to like the UK. Mm-hmm. So it is not an accident. Also in finance, we have a lot of cooperation, a lot of companies also in London. Ask any Swiss. There is a football game, Switzerland. There is a football game, Germany against the UK. I guess 80% of the Swiss support the UK because this is a big neighbor. Of course, we love the Germans, but emotionally, we feel closer with those who are a little bit far away.
You're bringing up a very important point, I think, because things like sports are very revealing of like true cultural biases. And even though there's like linguistic commonality with Germany, there's, I guess, I don't know, political interest alignment with UK as well as economic interest and balance of power. So it's interesting that that's reflected in popular culture as well, not just in government level things. That's actually a good point from which to answer your question to me, which is this whole tradition of what's good for GM is good for America, all the way to Goldman Sachs to Google. I think it actually goes back even longer to Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel, all in the 19th century. And to connect it up to sports, one of the interesting things is if you look at the evolution of American sports, it tracks the evolution of American industrial development. So American football, which I don't know how much Europeans are familiar with the structure of the game, but it's...
No, we have soccer. I think soccer is by far number one. And we attract all the global players. So I think the real powerhouse is the UK, it's Germany, it's Spain, probably a little bit France and Italy still. So it is really football, soccer, that is the number one game. So I think we are not really aware of what's going on, baseball and American football. We are too much into soccer.
So since, I came from India where American football was not known at all, but I grew up playing a little bit of soccer, even though India is like a terrible country at all sports. So,
but Wenka, there is a nice joke about Germans can feel relieved, and the UK and France, that India will never ever be a great football nation. You know why? Because they're good, very good retailers. Each time they get a corner, they open a store in the corner.
That's hilarious. But that's honestly actually true.
You look at competition, who might be stronger than the Germans in football? Who might be stronger than the Spanish people?
But it's interesting because the sports craze in India is cricket, and that's of course inherited from the British. And you can look at sort of the social structure of each of the games. In cricket, the focus is always on two people, the bowler and the batsman. And those two people are basically controlling the game for that given period. Soccer is pretty much all 10 versus 10 plus the goalkeepers. And at any given point, the action can shift from any small cluster to another cluster because it's a very fast changing game. And in So I think the sports that are dominant in each country tend to reflect sort of the business ethos of that country. And India, even though it's in Asia and people think of it as like a communitarian collectivist country, it's actually surprisingly individualistic if you zoom in a little bit. And the US and Europe, I think, is surprisingly collaborative. People work together. That's why they're able to build strong, good companies. But the US is interesting because it transitioned from more like a cricket type country to a more like collaborative country. Like if you look at the classic game of the US, it's baseball. And baseball is like cricket, and it's individualistic a little bit, and it reflects the mid-19th century America before the robber baron corporations. And if you look at how American football grew, which is a much more complicated team-oriented sport with like much more complex rules than soccer, it reflects sort of the organizational structure of like the growing big Standard Oil types of companies. And this is not a novel argument I'm making. Marshall McLuhan makes this argument. Several other commentators have made this argument. So the reason I'm bringing this up is when you look at phenomena like what's good for GM is good for the US, several observations can be made. One, I think it's always been true that the dominant industrial sort of base players have been viewed as what's good for that big industrial entity is good for the country, because the US has been sort of strongly shaped and every 20 or 30 years reshaped by a new wave of like industrial development following a new kind of business cycle. And this is the fundamental strength of the US, that it's able to reinvent itself economically.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But
even
wave, do you see an extra? I think what is interesting when you look at digitization, it is no longer just industry focused. When you look at Amazon, what is the industry they're in? What is Google? What is the industry they're in? Or Alphabet, of course, how it is called today. So will this completely redefine industries and probably redefine how different industries are being perceived?
Absolutely. And this is kind of the core thesis of Breaking Smart, as you know, which is that the software eating the world dynamic, when you visit San Francisco, talk to big VCs, talk to people who are in the heart of Facebook or Google, you kind of realize the force that's building up, the technological potential energy that's building up behind the dam, so to speak. So an analogy people like to make is between the railroad and steel industries in the 19th century and, big cloud-based data-driven businesses and algorithm-driven businesses today. And the analogy is inescapable. Like back then, if you were, say, just after the US Civil War and you were seeing the US railroad network being built on, if you were even slightly a visionary, you would say that this is going to change everything. People are going to move from farms to cities. They're going to work in like industrial towns. They're going to work in urban businesses, and farms are going to get mechanized. And all this was obvious to sort of anybody with imagination in like 1870. And it became absolutely true. By 1910, the US had completely made that transition. And it's in fact the US playbook of large-scale manufacturing, precision manufacturing, interchangeable parts that was then copied and perfected in places like Germany and Japan, where they took that same playbook and ran it and became really proficient at it. But by that time, the US had already moved on to the next game. And I think we saw this cycle repeat about 3 times in the previous century, where the US is really good at what you might call pioneering extremely large new markets and industries and technologies. But other countries tend to be slightly better at perfecting that game. So you've seen this lag happening. And it may happen with software and hardware as well. Like I would say in mechanical engineering and industrial engineering, even though the US started the scaled manufacturing game, Germany and Japan and Korea are now better at it. And similarly with everything like chemicals, electronics, radio, all these things, slowly it goes away. And very recently, of course, Intel is a prime example of they invented the semiconductor game, the chip game, the memory chip game, but then Japan took the memory chip game, then they invented the microprocessor game and became really good at that and are still the best at that. But then ARM is a British company, right? And they Intel now partnered with ARM and the mobile phone revolution, its chips are being made by a company based in the UK. So this game continues over and over. And with software, I would say it's the same thing. The difference is that software is extremely reliant on human capital. Other things, natural resources can be a big asset. Nearness to markets can be a big asset. If you're near a big market, that's a big asset. But software, 90% of the driving factor is how good your technical talent is and how concentrated they are. And right now, Silicon Valley.
The most interesting is how we're going to redefine the old factors like land, capital, and labor. So when you go to the negative scenarios, we discuss them very often here in Europe. I think to a certain degree also in the US, automation will come more. You have also intellectual jobs that can be easily algorithmicized. And with artificial intelligence, you don't even probably no longer need lawyers, because what you can write down as an algorithm, argue rationally, you don't need a human being behind it anymore. So is it true that in the extreme scenario, basically capital will win and labor becomes only for a super intelligent people attractive, and space and land will be just available, but no longer really have the same importance as in the past? Like in the agrarian society or in manufacturing economy, where you need a lot of space, a lot of infrastructure.
So you asked several very interesting questions there. So the easy one is actually the one about automation and jobs, and there's two answers there. One is it's the same as has happened 4 times before in history, where it looks like all the jobs are going away. And yes, all the old economy jobs do go away. Like farming is now maybe 4% in Western countries, right?
Yeah,
but
much less here in Europe.
Yeah,
but it's heavily subsidized.
Actually, even in the US, I think it's maybe 2% now. And so manufacturing is also in similar, I think maybe double digit, like 10 to 15.
Very interesting to see that on one side we heavily subsidize agriculture, and when you look at the overall perceived value by people, look at local food and all these things and all the niches that are now coming, young farmers, young entrepreneurs. So you see a romantic revival, which charging hell a lot of money for meat, any agriculture product. You thought, no, this is going to be imported from any other places. Now you see urban gardening, urban farming, and people love it. And we see even more people, highly educated people, well-traveled people who start to be farmers here in Europe. But you can say this romance, but it's nonetheless, it's interesting.
I think it is. But from an economic perspective, I don't think it'll ever account to much, because, I mean, 7 billion planet, right?
Yes. Would you love to be a farmer in India these days?
Even places like India, it's changing, right? I mean, it used to be something like 70 to 80% in agriculture when I was growing up. Now I believe it's down to less than 50%. So it's like no part of the world is safe from this process. And that's actually a good thing, because you want people to be doing higher value work. And I think that's what's happening. So one part of the answer is, and when I was at GDI last, I was arguing with Doug Rushkoff about this. One part of the answer is, yes, each time this happens, new kinds of industry crop up and new kinds of jobs that we never imagined come up. Like right now, we just saw earlier this year, the whole Pokemon in augmented reality, right?
That's a great example also for our speeches. You say, okay, this is the starting point of something new.
Exactly. And think about the trajectory of like regular 2-dimensional video gaming. 30 years ago, it didn't even exist as a sector. Now it rivals the movie industry in size. The movie industry didn't exist in 1890, but once movies were invented, they became far bigger than Broadway and traditional stage theater, right? So that process continues, where we keep finding more and more things for humans to do. But of course, there are people who argue, each time there's always people who argue that this time it's different. And that's...
it's a big question.
Yeah, it's a legitimate question, which means you have to reanalyze the situation. You can't just lazily say that this is like 1825 and textile industry. You have to re-answer the question. And I think we are slowly figuring out the answer. I fall on the side of, yes, we are going to invent more jobs. In the US, jobs have already rebounded to pre-recession levels. The difference, of course, is that the mix changes and the distribution and inequality levels change. Like, as you've mentioned, people who work for Google, if you look at a very useful metric, which is market cap of the company divided by number of employees, it becomes huge. Like, we've already seen the 1 million per employee companies there. People are predicting that we'll soon see companies with $1 billion market cap per employee. So that's the core. That's the extremely high value people.
But this is just the small elite, I guess.
Yeah. And this is, I think, the important 1%. Like, we talk a lot about the 1% versus 99%, but the 1% we get angry about today, yeah, that's mostly old money, Wall Street type financial capital, stores of capital.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, that's 300 years old. Some of these old stores of wealth are hundreds of years old. But this new 1% or 0.1% is not financial capital. It's sort of technological talent capital. Like, there's only a handful of people around the world who know how to design like a high-end processor from scratch. This is a very, very difficult talent, right? So they will form the core of the new economy, and they will be highly compensated in many ways. And of course, we are seeing the gig economy, which you asked me about, emerge all around it, right? And the gig economy is, on the one hand...
This is my point, because this is the key to understand Western Europe, especially France, Germany, but also Switzerland, Austria to a certain degree, Spain, Italy. They have a well-established system of not protecting, but to a certain degree to covering expenses and the safety net for people who have modest and mid-level incomes. Mm-hmm. So if you move more towards an economy that is faster, more flexible, on demand, a lot of people's biggest fear here in Europe is we are going to lose all these safety nets, and we become dependent on those who have capital and those who have just the means. Like in Uber, the Uber is always the case, of course, that is mentioned, just basically to erect people's lives, and they become sort of modern slaves with a certain money available, but not really being free like in the past. This is, I think, the biggest fear in a nutshell.
Yeah, and the response to that fear is take Silicon Valley out of the picture, take companies like Uber out of the picture. The equation doesn't change. I mean, Europe has an aging population, as we discussed. It already has a huge debt crisis, and it's already clear that the equation of that kind of safety net with that kind of demographics, with that kind of immigration policy, you can't balance that equation with or without Silicon Valley technology. And in my opinion, if you put Silicon Valley into that equation, it only adds to the positive side of that equation. It only allows you to balance that equation better, right? But to address the question itself, this is where I think we have the biggest unknowns. Are we going to see sort of basically a reinvention of labor unions and collective action and solidarity of, 1910 style for the new economy? Somehow I think that's somewhat unlikely, because the structure of the new industries with ecosystems around like algorithmic and automated cores is very different. And
it is, yeah, sure.
Yeah, the interests don't align in the same way. And but so I do think the gig economy is sort of booting up, and it will become the basis. And yes, the income will be volatile, but it doesn't need to be precarious. Because yes, of course, driverless cars will come and Uber type business models will go away, and instead there won't even be driving jobs, but there'll be different kinds of gigs. Like maybe there'll be new kinds of gig economy around creating Pokemon, hotspots, something like that, right? So we don't know. But your question of how does this alter the classic land, labor, capital, structure of capital? Yes, on the one hand, intellectual capital in the form of ideas and thinking become extremely important. And you could say that what Deirdre McCloskey, the economist, she calls talk. Yeah, right. Talk is like, cultural capital or human capital. That in 1,000 years ago, that was maybe 5% of the capital value of population. Now maybe it'll become 50, 60%. I don't know. But it's not that things like land become less valuable. Like look at what's happening in San Francisco, Vancouver, Seattle. What happens is we are now moving, because of these new industries, to extremely dense urban living environments, and due to like weird conditions, land value is getting completely insane. Like it's now impossible unless you're a millionaire.
Depending on the spots. We see the same here in Europe, but as soon as you go to the more rural areas, it might change completely. Like in Japan, where you see cities like Tokyo, Osaka, they are becoming bigger and bigger, but the rural area, the mid-sized villages, or even cities, they're about to disappear.
Yeah.
So the move towards cities, I don't know whether it will be lasting. When you look at the biggest challenge, I guess, when you go more towards a world that is digitized, you can do more with less and less. I think that's the best phrase. Yeah. I guess it's from you, isn't it?
No, that's from Buckminster Fuller. I quoted Buckminster Fuller.
Okay, there's another great smart guy. Yeah, good.
Much smarter than me.
It's true. So we must understand that also in terms of income, really less to have a good life. The Economist recently tried to figure out, I don't know whether it was their figure, how much in terms of services we consume in Europe and in the US that is free. Just, GPS system, WhatsApp, you name it, it's over 300 billion US dollars already. It doesn't appear in any statistics.
Yeah.
This is here and we take it for granted. And especially the younger generation here, they're very, very, I think, spoiled with all these gadgets. They take it for granted. Music, I paid a fortune when I was young.
Yeah.
Vinyl and everything. So compared to what our kids now have, they have an extremely good life with all these for free things. They pay with data, with time. But I think we should understand the real value of all these products that are, in parentheses, for free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you're right now in the statistics. And for me, the real question right now is, you're from India, and your prime minister said, we are going to leapfrog, we will have smart cities. But this also means that they have what Danny Roderick calls premature disindustrialization. Very often you don't need the old industrial heavyweight structure anymore. So you can already leapfrog and you can build drone-based delivery systems. I don't know what. I gave a talk recently in Kuala Lumpur, and the moderator was an Indian. He said, listen, what you said about the future of consumption and delivery systems, we are going to build that in India. We don't need all the old structures you have in Europe and in the US. He was very optimistic. I found that great. But if that's true, what does that mean for income structure coming back to Europe? When you look at industrialization, why is Germany still strong? The reason is they peaked in the workforce, in the manufacturing business in the 70s at roughly said 40%. Mm-hmm. France was a little bit lower, but also they peaked in the 70s, 30-something percent. But when you look at emerging nations like Brazil or even China, they peaked at a much lower level, let's say 18, 19, 20%, meaning they could not create a wealthy middle class that has reached a certain level of capital, a certain level of assets they have now available. So I think that's also an interesting question to see if you're going towards a more not traditionally money-based, capital-based economy. What does that mean? Do people feel poor or not? Or what are we going to measure?
I think it's going to take a lot longer for that to happen. Like the leapfrog argument in places like India, honestly, I think at this point it's 80%, I don't know, overconfidence plus insecurity speaking at once. Where the problem, I mean, yeah, but it's...
An Indian economist once said at a conference, it's too late to be pessimistic.
Yes, I think there is merit to that case, especially because demographics is on the side of countries like India, like the bulk of the population is under 30 or whatever. But leapfrogging, there's a certain sort of fallacious structure to the leapfrogging argument, which is that you don't get to sort of the sophisticated industrial, post-industrial base of doing like billion-dollar Google-like software companies starting straight from like high-intensity labor farming. You can't make that leap. It takes a couple of generations of, building universities or the equivalents of universities, but it can happen much faster. And you're already seeing that people are using everything from Khan Academy to online education to move faster, but it's not as easy as people make it out to be. But I think, yes, overall, with lots of troubles, taking in mind what you're saying, that we don't account for the free stuff as well. Like even you and I, even though we didn't grow up with smartphones, we had our own free things, right? I mean, 200 years ago, everybody had to learn how to, every adult male had to learn how to fight. They need to know how to use a sword, use a gun or whatever. And that was a huge cost of just living. You had to know how to be good at defending yourself and physically fighting.
I was a cyclist in the Swiss army.
Uh-huh.
I was recruited as a cyclist because the argument was back in 1980 that you are fast, you're nearly invisible, you know, especially when it's dark, you're flexible, and so you can support other parts of the army easily. So it was funny. It was really funny. But the Swiss had a tradition, and it was also interesting. The Swiss strength in economy was built up on being member of the liberal, democratic or conservative party and being an official, being a sergeant, a major in the Swiss army.
Yep.
And when we cut that, for example, large companies like UBS, they had hundreds of secretaries who worked during paid labor time for UBS. Now, formerly it was, of course, Schweizerische Bankgesellschaft. They worked for the Swiss army. But this put the business and everything together. And only in the 90s, with more and more globalization, this system collapsed. Mm-hmm. But in terms of creating, this is my point, to create the sense of unity. And even if you're a global banker, you are still Swiss. And your interest basically boils down to what is the interest of Switzerland. And when this system collapsed, you now have sort of a denationalized global elite. They do their job. They are brilliant, very well educated, but they feel no longer loyal to a certain country or a certain bank.
And I think in the short term, we are going to see the downsides of that more severely. But in the long term, that's a good thing, because the positive side of things like solidarity built through like shared military experience or like, you know, working for a big company, that helps build like the industrial base, the social base, and so forth. But in the long term, that creates this sort of inertia and sense of like security that when economic changes happen, that's when you don't know how to adapt, and it sort of creates reactionary movements and extreme right reactions and so forth. On the flip side, if you have, say, you know, third culture people who live a multinational life, don't seem to have any particular loyalty to any particular region, they have a harder time creating solidarity and collective action and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, you have to ask, in this sort of future where everything is being leapfrogged and big centralized institutions are less important and everybody can sort of meet their needs through a mix of automated infrastructure on the one hand and through like relatively individual or small group action on the other. So you have like these big automated Google type platforms on the one hand. On the other hand, it's like you don't need to be part of a 10,000 person company or a 1 million strong army. You can have your group of 15, 20 friends with whom you're very loyal. They might be all over the world. Like you and I, we have collaborated for several years, and you are a small think tank. I'm a one-person business, and I have identities in 2 countries. You have identities in one small country, but also a whole your Western Europe continent. But you and I are now part of like a small virtual network that's a different kind of place for accumulating cultural and economic value, right? So, and I think that's the future where it's going to leapfrog, but that leapfrogging is not going to leave.
Do you think that will be the future for the many, or will it just stay rather something that stays within the 10% we mentioned before?
I think it'll be the future for 100%, because what's been the limiting factor so far? It's been immigration, and it's been sort of financial disparities in, you know, currency regimes and things like that. So immigration first, I think current statistics are that less than 3% of the world will ever leave their home country. But already virtual reality, like, you know, like video conferencing.
Yeah, 3% are now outside the country of origin, yeah.
Yeah, but look at what...
That were 10% or 15%, then you're already over 1 billion, if 15%.
Yeah.
Can countries stomach that? I think from the standpoint of an American, it's easy. You have the land available. You have also, when you look, why did people from Europe move to the United States?
Mm-hmm.
The first thing was of clearly get rid of aristocracy, of old hierarchies, enjoy freedom. And the second one, I think, is very important and underestimated when you try to understand Europe. It was also the freedom of religion. You could have a life where you have a religious everyday life, whereas in Europe, France, of course, is the extreme case. You have a complete separation of religion. This is only private, and the state, that is really the public. So France is a case, but in Germany and in the UK also secularism is differently defined from the US. So we are in Europe, we are not trained and we don't have the legacy like the US to easily melt the religious life, the private life, and the public life. Tell a France to put on the euro coin, in God we trust, he will not understand that. It's simply, it's a different way. So that the French, they have not the understanding of religion anymore. So it's not an accident they have so many troubles.
Yeah.
In Germany, the same is true in the UK. You have a separation. The UK is always a little bit more friendly. They hide their problems. But in France, they pop up.
Yeah. And I think even in the US, because of its peculiar political structure, it's only a small percentage that's like extremely core conservative, sincerely religious, that has extreme political power. I would say religious sentiment in the US, depending on how you measure it, at a social nominal level where people go to church for weddings or social reasons, it may be very high, 70, 80%. But at a sincere level, if you don't count Catholic immigration from the Hispanic regions, which is a slightly different culture, in the Anglo-Saxon world, I would say it's kind of like Europe. It's mostly 70 to 80% are basically secular, maybe 10 to 15% are sincerely religious, but they have disproportionate influence. But to your point about how this...
The minorities that are strong, that exactly know what they want, they can easily gain the majority. You can measure that in terms of food. Taleb wrote an interesting piece about that recently. Yeah. So that, for example, vegans, we do have about 2,000 vegans in Switzerland. But interestingly, they have the majority on the shelves. You have to put on all the retail shelves, you have to put vegan foods. You can go to any restaurant. It's not just vegetarian, it's vegan. Gluten-free, there are about 1% who have really an allergy. But when you see now gluten-free is perceived as something healthy. So interestingly, when you want to change agriculture, you don't have to do lobbying and to change big ag. And I think Taleb underlined that brilliantly. You just have to look at the small trends with very, very, let's say, intolerant minorities, but who know exactly what they want. So I think in many parts, it is true in religion also. Yep. When you look at Salafists in Germany, it's tiny, but they can influence a lot of the Muslim community, which is a pity.
And I think that's exactly how this sort of a new culture is being shaped. When I said that 100% can now live in this sort of post-national, tribalized kind of landscape, this sort of dynamic is what I'm talking about. It's not the economic 1% that will necessarily have power. It can be the vegan 1% or the extremist Islamic 1%. Like if you compare, say, European immigration in the 19th century, somebody had religious oppression and moved to the US for religious freedom. Compare that to the Islamic world now. Like there's this woman in Pakistan who became an Instagram celebrity. So she was, well, one of the more liberal, forward-thinking young women, and she became an Instagram celebrity. And she was, like, by Western standards, just doing the normal kind of like self-promotion and building an image. But her family murdered her as an honor killing, like you're besmirching the honor. Now, if you look at Pakistani society, it's not that different from Indian society. Politically, it's very different. It's much more Islamic leaning. But I would say it's still, there's a large, relatively moderate middle class, but they're not the ones controlling the agenda. It's these pockets of extremism that will do things like this, where the moment a woman sort of gets too big for sort of male egos, she'll actually get killed. And it's a small minority that can make that happen. But look at how she actually, in a sense, immigrated. She didn't immigrate physically from Pakistan to the US. She immigrated virtually into Instagram, which is where she found her freedom of expression and religion, right?
That's a very interesting case, yeah. But I think the great advantage regarding immigration in the US is really when you come to the US, you immediately know that you have to change, you're going to give up something else.
Yep.
Which is not the case. I think when you look what is the most coveted passport, it's Germany, because within a few months, Germany became the number one country. Everybody wants to go to Germany. Why? Because there you have a social safety net, you have the welfare state, you have asylum right that is really very favorable for people who seek refuge. You don't have to change. You can stay like you want, because the more you have of a certain community, the more new people you attract. So Germany, I think, is for me is already a good case to see there we have Turkish communities within the German society. And again, you have extremely segmented groups within the Turkish population. Again, you have those who are 100% assimilated. You have elites, they are like very traditional Germans. But on the other side, you have people who have been living there for more than now 1 or 2 generations. They don't speak German at all. So I think this adds to the complexity of leading a country in the future, because you have so many interests, so diverse opinions, and to be a good leader. I think in the US it is still easier because you have a better common denominator, whereas we no longer know where we want to go. I think confusion is the biggest, the single common denominator here in Europe. We don't know what we stand for. When you ask people in Germany, yeah, we need more integration, but what the hell, integrate them into what? They don't know what. In the US, it's clear. You're becoming part of a very individualistic system. You have to perform. No one will help you. Individualism is differently defined than in Europe. In Europe, individualism is always perceived as something that is being part of a community. And with the welfare state, you're being financed. We will not let you down. Whereas when you go to the US, you immediately know you're on your own. Find a way to finance your family and everything. Whereas when you come to Germany, you know, you can bring all your family and they get a lot of, the more kids you have, the more money you get. This is not something sustainable for the future. So they have to figure out the new system.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you that the US is easier to govern politically on that front. On the other hand, it's also harder because structurally the US political system allows small veto players a lot more power. Like what we were talking about, vegans controlling sort of how the food culture evolves, that's a cultural phenomenon. It's done through like soft power. But in the US, through the court system, through like political action, very small minorities can actually control the hard power part of politics much more easily than they can in Europe. But the interesting thing is, despite this bias towards structural, special interest groups dominating the system structurally, the US still has kind of more of a common denominator, like you mentioned. And I think this common denominator does not have to do with the safety net, which is kind of the bottom of the common denominator, but it has to do with sort of the aspiration. Like there's always been this idea of an American dream. So what unites people who come to America is not the idea that they're going to get a safety net, which is kind of like a defensive insurance related kind of motivation. But what unites people who come to the US is there's this notion of an American dream and what it means to succeed, and a certain set of values that you buy into, whether you're coming from Mexico or you're coming from the Arab world or you're coming from India. People generally self-select in a way that says, all right, there's a certain dream. And right now, to bring the conversation back to Silicon Valley, the American dream literally is learn something, some skills in technology, move to Silicon Valley, be part of like the next big Google or something, and become rich. And this kind of frontier of aspiration gets reinvented every 20, 30 years, but there's always one, which is kind of why the US is very interesting. And of course, the hard case is, say, something like Islamic extremism. And always there are going to be, there's going to be a spectrum. And in the US, you see the same as well. There are people coming from Islamic countries who get radicalized and never integrate and become sort of, even after 2 generations, they may be the seeds of terrorist attacks. But on the other hand, you have other immigrants who move to Silicon Valley, integrate, and they may still have like distinctive Islamic identities, but they also integrate well, create big companies,
Yes.
and share the dream, so to speak. And I think that's really important because the US, in a sense, this goes back to what's good for GM is good for the US. There's a very corporate aspect to the way the US works, in the sense that it has the equivalent of a corporate mission. Like back in the 19th century, it was almost a racist manifest destiny mission, where it was Native Americans can be wiped out and white people have a right to the land. But now it's become a much more solid way of thinking about missions, which is anytime industrial growth stagnates, you go back to the idea of the frontier, of the sort of Wild West, and say, all right, how can we sort of create a new frontier? And then the American dream gets reinvented around that frontier. And I think Europe used to be that way, maybe in 13th century Italy during the Renaissance time. But since then, Europe has lost this idea of a frontier. And that may be the reason for...
Yes, it has. It doesn't know how to cope with new forms of government after the nation state. I think this is the biggest challenge. When you look, France is the strongest nation state you might imagine, with their history, Republican tradition, and they always relate to all these traditions. And it's very difficult, I think, in France to move the system. It's much more difficult than in Germany, where you have more entrepreneurial spirit, I guess, and less bureaucracy that is centralized. I'm not pessimistic for Europe. I think even that the demographic issue is overrated. When you look at new research that has been done, for example, in Vienna, we don't need a replacement rate of 2.2 in the rich nations. We only need a replacement rate between 1.5 and 1.6, which would give a lot of relief. Because people are working longer, they are more productive. So I'm less pessimistic about the demographic issue. I think really it is much more the question, how can politics, the economy, and let's say borderless flow of goods, flow of people, flow of money, how we can make that work better over the next years. That's for me more important than demography. I think even when you look at Japan, you might argue that the Japanese GDP is shrinking, which is not false. But when you look closer, GDP per capita is still very high compared to the US, who has a lot of immigration. So I think Japan will stay the most interesting country in terms of demographics to watch. Also, when you're very under pressure, in the best case, you become innovative.
Yeah.
It's like running out of oil. Well, does it matter when you run out of oil? No, we become innovative. We have to find a new solution.
Yep. I think I agree with you, where people...
Do we need more and more people? I think this is the trap in all the economic theories. We need growth, and growth in the industrial age always meant population growth. But as countries become richer, you can take any nation. The female is much better integrated in the workforce. You can have solo living. You're no longer dependent on traditional family structures, which I think is fine. You will have less kids. This is the normal way. And when you look at those countries, you really produce a lot of kids. It's where the females have at least only a few rights, less education, which I think is a pity. You waste a lot of interesting creativity, capital, and everything. So the idea just to have a population that is shrinking should be taken into consideration in a future successful business model for an economy.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you on things like, GDP growth is sort of a dated measure, and we already talked about how invisible growth, which is not accounted in the GDP, is growing. Like the free stuff is growing pretty fast. So if you are able to account for that clearly, I think you would find that GDP is actually growing absolutely, not just remaining high per capita. And yes, there's always this race between demographics on the one hand and automation on the other. So I think that's the race of interest. Like, can we automate and create wealth faster than demographics is getting rid of the human capital needed to fuel it? Like, it doesn't matter if the world is full of 120-year-old people who are living sort of long lives. If
Well, it's probably aesthetically not a very convincing idea. He does not do a very, very good job, but in theory, yes, why not?
Yeah, why not? And there's lots of good science fiction based on that premise of like, very long lives. Like I just read Bruce Sterling's Matrix novel, and some of the scenarios are people live for hundreds of years, and at 100 you're still considered young, and automation does most of the work, and most of what you need is basically free. And I think that is the sort of future we can actually get to. And
very interesting questions when you look deeper at these issues. We did a study recently for a life insurance company about digital aging. When you really project a life that is not really ending until, let's say, 120, 125, 130, you get a completely different outlook of your life.
Yep.
Completely different. It's very funny because then you see suicide might be a very interesting option. Being killed in a car accident might be something very special because otherwise you no longer die. What do you do with all the time when you say, okay, listen, I'm going to do that job for 3 years. I'm going to do that job for 5 years. Now listen, after that 5 years, another 5 times or 6 times 5 years to learn and retrain. Does that make sense? So all the existentialist questions pop up when you have great digital perspectives where you have no end in sight. So I think for me, demographics is very interesting.
And I think there'll always be people who figure out more imaginative ways to make use of even 1,000 years. And there will be people who run out of imagination at age 60 and choose euthanasia, right? And this is the context in which I think we have to think about how digital futures are transforming things. And I think along the way, we will actually see the end of the nation state as we've understood it in the last 400 years, where since you brought up France, that's actually a good note to end on because it ties all the themes together. Where, first of all, there's going to be a Breaking Smart French translation coming out in the next few weeks.
That would be fantastic. That would be great.
And, but as you said, France in some sense invented the most perfect form of the modern nation state and currently exhibits in its most perfect form. And that's become both its greatest strength as national identity and greatest weakness. And an anecdote that brings that out in sharp relief is Pierre Omidyar. So he's French, but of Iranian ancestry. So there's a relationship to the Middle East. I don't know if he's actually of Islamic heritage, but he's of Iranian descent, born in France. But he had to go to the US to build eBay, and he helped build Kiva, which is the nonprofit network. And recently when he was asked, he said he could not have done anything that he did if he had stayed in France. And I think the story of Pierre Omidyar actually captures the future. Like they, say the future is unevenly distributed and it's already here. That's William Gibson's line. Pierre Omidyar's—
It's very true.
His story illustrates that, don't you think? His parents came from Iran. He was born in France. He grew up French. He left to go to the US, created eBay, then created Kiva, which is now helping transform Africa. And he now says that he couldn't have done what he did in France. And that's an indication that the nation state is on its way out. And I think that's kind of where we're headed.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it will be like, for guys like you and me, it will be fascinating to observe and to just put your hands into the steering wheel. We will soon no longer have steering wheels, I guess. This will also be the past, but as long as we can, we try to have an impact.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, David. I think we're almost at the hour. So any closing thoughts?
Well, listen, I think we just made what we call in France a tour d'horizon. So I don't know. It's up to you to decide whether it makes sense to send that out.
What does that French phrase mean?
Well, we gave the big picture of what's going on.
Okay.
But it's up to you to decide whether your friend should watch now what we just previously discussed or not.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, David. And all the best for GDI's current futures research. And I'm sure you guys will continue to do great work. And hope to see you guys in Switzerland sometime soon.
Sure, we will. We will. Thank you very much. See you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
David.